I have the time. Well, the time for me is 8:15 because I'm on European time at the moment. But I do think it is time for us to go ahead and get started with our fourth session. Thank you for sticking around for these talks. I've been enjoying what I've heard so far. I hope everyone else has as well. We have two presentations in session four. Session four is on texts and editions. Our first speaker will be Anna de Backer, and then we will have a joint presentation by Curtis Rager. Sorry if I'm butchering your guys' names, and Maria Carrière, if you wanted me to throw that at you. But as with the previous sessions, we'll have a Q&A following both presentations. So please do, audience members, post your questions throughout the presentations in our chat window, but know that we will address your questions after both presentations. So without further ado, oh, by the way, I'm Lauren. My name is Lauren Lee. Hello, I'm a member of the GSC, and I'll be here on the GSC next year as well. That's me. Hello. So our first presentation is by Anna de Backer. Anna de Backer is a postdoctoral fellow with the Linked Music Project of McGill University, working on metadata schemes of chant and early music. She is also a research associate with the digital analysis of chant transmission, a project based in Dalhousie University, for which she collects and inventories photographs of chant fragments owned by enthusiasts across the globe, and occasionally talks about them on social media. That's great. A graduate from the Medieval Institute of the University of Notre Dame, where the MA will be having our annual meeting, and where she worked on the Cistercian office liturgies from the 13th century Belgium. She now lives in Montreal, where she also works as a singer. Go Anna. Okay. Without further ado, Anna de Backer.
All right, thank you. Let me just share my screen and play my slides. Oops. Let's play my slides. All right. So, hi everyone. I'm here to talk about two of my favorite things. That's chant fragments and a tool called Cantus Ultimus, and applying the one to the other. So in the next 10 minutes, I hope to be able to convince you of three things. Manuscript fragments help us know about chant. Cantus Ultimus helps us know even more about chant. And so together, they help us know a lot about chant. And that is really cool. So why do we want to know about chant in the first place? Chant took up a huge part of the daily life of any medieval Christian religious community. And chants could differ a lot from one place to another. Some institutions might celebrate a local saint that another place might not, or they might choose different chants to tell the musical story of that saint. They might choose different melodies for the same text chant as a matter of conscious preference, or maybe as an unconscious way if they participated in oral transmission of music. So the more chant books we know about, the more we know about the communities that created them and the networks that connected them. Now, many of us here already have some idea of the importance of fragments for the study of medieval manuscripts, especially if you were at the panel 2 hours ago. Fragments can be valuable evidence for works that have otherwise been lost or forgotten, and they can also tell us about the ways that manuscript pages do survive, whether it's because they've been repurposed as book bindings or specially collected as art objects. Chant books are practical books, which means their contents could get out of date. But their pages are also really large and also quite distinctive, which gave them a few avenues for survival. So a lot of fragments are chant fragments, and some chants are only available in chant fragments. And that means fragments give us a lot of really interesting data points that we want to study. And if you happen to know of any chant fragments that are hanging on a wall near you, please visit our website and tell me more about it. Now, one really interesting example of a chant book that's been fragmented, it's so interesting you can read a whole book about it, is the Gottschalk Antiphonal. This is a collection of 30 folios from a 12th century chant book for the daily services at Lambach Abbey in Austria. And it's a real visual delight thanks to the talented scribe and illuminator Gottschalk, which is hence the name, and who also added this tidy new notation above the text that you can see here. After centuries of use at the Abbey, it eventually just stopped being practical to use for liturgy. And the pages were reused, and the pages were reused as book bindings. Those were in turn sold, and they ended up scattered in the 20th century everywhere from Yale Library to a traveling show in St. Louis to a hotel in Austria. But thanks to online reconstruction tools like Fragmentarium, which you maybe heard about earlier today, you can now see the pages reunited, making this fragmented source more accessible. Now, it's one thing to just see so many digitized manuscripts, but often what we really want is metadata, the information about them and about their contents. For chants, that might be information about when it was sung, or where it was sung, or even whether it was sung. And we've had for a long time a resource for that, the Contest database, which dates back up to the dawn of the internet, back in sneakernet of sending people discs in the mail. And over the several decades of its existence, several decades, this database has accumulated information about over 500,000 chants from hundreds of chant sources, both books and fragments. And each chant is linked to others sharing the same text, which makes it possible to compare chant usage across places, times, and manuscripts, and analyze things like when a chant was used for, when in the day it was sung, variations in the text, and when it's been transcribed, the melody. Now, what if we took that a step farther? Enter Contest Ultimus, which aligns this chant metadata available on the Contest database with manuscript images that are served from their host libraries. This means that our data and our metadata are served from the same place and searchable. Now, this has a lot of useful consequences. Suppose, for example, we are looking at this manuscript from Benedictine Abbey in Switzerland, and we want to find the spot in it that has chants for the Feast of the Assumption. We can make use of metadata that we've already collected about the chants, use it as a guide to the manuscript, and end up seeing our chants and our metadata alongside one another. The image on the one hand, our metadata, our transcription, our music, and even audio capabilities on the right. We can also easily compare chants among manuscripts. You can go right to the page if you search your own name, for example, hypothetically, and go right to a page of other manuscripts on the site that have those chants. And that lets us view annotations or decorations of the manuscript itself alongside all of this useful chant metadata. Now, that's particularly useful for music manuscripts. Transcribing musical notation is a pretty specialized task. It takes a long time, and it's hard. Now, soon, Contest Ultimus will incorporate some machine learning-aided musical transcription, which will help the analysis of many more chant melodies. But even then, it's fairly limiting. And learning about the music is especially difficult for some manuscripts, which are written in neumes that don't record exact pitch. The notation on this manuscript assumes that you already know basically how a chant goes. Swooshes like this one tell you that on this syllable, the pitch goes up and then down again. But it doesn't tell you how far to go. Is it this far down or is it this far down? For these manuscripts, seeing the images is essential to interpret melodic information, and that's something that Contest Ultimus allows. So what happens when we introduce a tool like Contest Ultimus to our old friend, the Gottschalk antiphonor? The metadata for Gottschalk has been in Contest database since the mid-90s. The pictures have been online since at least 2018. But until now, they hadn't been combined. We still have some planning to do about how to interact with single pages of fragments versus reconstructions and ways of using partial text on the page. But for now, this is here where we are behind the scenes in 2024, this particular feature of fragments coming to you very shortly in just a few weeks' time. So here we are, and here is the beautiful Gottschalk antiphonor in all its glory, scrollable on Contest Ultimus. You might notice the pages are of different shapes and sizes. We've got filler placeholders for where there are gaps in the manuscript, and some pages are varying in image quality or color because they're coming from different institutions. Each image has been mapped to the relevant part of the transcription from the Contest database. On the sidebar, you can accordion open each chant and see all the searchable metadata and the full reconstructed text in cases where there's only part of it. This is very useful for finding your way around a reconstructed manuscript like this one. We don't always know with certainty what order the pages go in or what their original foliation was, but we do know what their content was. So if you want to find chants for St. Agatha, you can search for them without having to remember that, for example, this chant for Agatha is on what Beinecke Library calls Folio 5R and the Reconstruction calls 42R. Or maybe you want to know where that cool angel on the front cover of Lisa Fagan Davis's book came from. Here's a chant containing the word Angelus, and we can just find it and our lovely angel here in the corner. Or finally, maybe you've noticed these letters in the margins and want to know more about those. Surprising as it may seem, these are actually musical information that classify chants by particular melody patterns that they share. And since that musical information is recorded in our metadata, we can search this and see how Gottschalk labeled these chants that he was working with, in this case IK, and how his classification scheme works, which gives us insights into how those melody patterns could work in Gottschalk's time and place. But maybe you're not just so interested in classifying music. You really want to know what music sounds like, right? But as I've said, this notation assumes that you already know this chant, and all you really need is to remember the shape of it, that it goes up and then down and up and down and up and down. But we're not the monks of 12th century Lombok. We don't have in our heads what the melody this is supposed to record. Now, we don't happen to have any monks handy to demonstrate the chant for us, unfortunately. But we are 21st century people with Cantus Ultimus at our disposal. So we can look up this chant in another manuscript, for example, this one. Here it is in our Benedictine monastery from Switzerland with audio capabilities. And so we can hear if Gottschalk's gestures are recording the same basic chant shape. So we can actually see that this is in fact the same chant melody, and we can see that there are maybe even slight variations in the gestures that are recorded. In a sense, we're participating in a kind of musical listening, remembering, and recording process in a way that's not actually that unlike the monks that the Gottschalk Antiphonor was created for, in ways that they would never have imagined. I hope I've shown you a few of the possibilities that digital tools open up for chant fragments. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much for that, Anna. I'm really looking for the Q&A on that one. We will be saving questions for the very end, as I said. So for our second presentation, we have, how do you say your last name, Curtis?
It's Rager with a hard G.
Rager. Okay, I thought
Yes.
Rager, like, woo, let's go. Okay.
Oh.
And Maria, and your last name as well?
Carrier.
Carrier. Okay. Excellent. Lovely. But I see both of you are French scholars, so that's, you know, we can do some like Roger and like Carrier. Anyway, okay. Curtis Rager is a history PhD student in his second year at Fordham University. He researches monastic documentary and legal culture in France in the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. Curtis joined the Siege of Antioch project as an XML editor in the fall semester of 2022 and took over as a co-project manager in 2023. Maria Carrier is a second-year PhD student in the history department, also at Fordham University. Her research focuses on women, gender, and political culture in France and in the Near East in the 12th and 13th centuries. Maria joined the Siege of Antioch project as an XML editor in the fall semester of 2022 and took over as co-project manager in 2023. Excellent. Take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you again to all the organizers for making this happen. Let me pull these slides up really quick, if I can find them. There they are. And let me sort of situate all of my many windows on my computer right now. Okay, so you guys can see everything here now? Yes? Okay, perfect. So The Siege of Antioch project presents an open source digital edition of the Siège d'Antioche, a previously unedited, sprawling Old French epic, which principally relates the events of the Siege of Antioch in 1097 during the First Crusade. The Siege of Antioch project is the result of a collaboration between Fordham's Center for Medieval Studies and 4 scholars of Old French literature based in the UK.
These UK scholars listed here on the screen are the project's primary textual editors. They produce an edition that uses the 2 full manuscripts of the Siège d'Antioche, Oxford Bodleian Library MS Hatton 77, the base for the edition, and London British Library additional manuscript Spalding 34114, plus 2 fragments. They also produce an English translation. Fordham's responsibility in the project is to create, publish, and maintain the digital edition, hosted online through Fordham's digital project site. A major goal of the project is to expand the audience, so Fordham team, including Dr. Nicholas Paul, Caterina Fostano, and our graduate students, are also responsible for working on secondary apparatuses that aim to augment the text. The apparatuses contain supplementary material that is designed to give readers the information needed to understand the important people, places, and terms within the text. These resources are constantly being expanded by the Fordham team with the goal of making the Siège d'Antioche accessible to students and users with no prior experience in Crusade studies or medieval history, as well as scholars and specialists.
The Siege of Antioch project, or as we call it, SAP, contributes to the digital humanities at Fordham and the wider scholarly community in a number of different ways. First, a full translation of this work has yet to be published. The text is very long. It is about 20,000 lines, and it is over 400 lesses, a less being a strophe of a regular length, which characterizes Old French epics. So the text length has been an impediment to scholarly engagement with the Crusade narrative as a whole. It's rarely cited among narratives of the First Crusade, and it has never been traditionally published in edition or translation. However, the text is an important source of historical information on the siege and the First Crusade. So making the text broadly available in digital form is then an important scholarly effort, both for scholars of the Crusades and for scholars of Old French verse and history writing. A digital edition, along with our interactive digital apparatuses, is ideal for the Siège d'Antioche because of the text's length, the complexity of its narrative, and the number of characters. A digital edition also makes the text more accessible because specialists interested in the Old French edition can access the text remotely, and the website also contextualizes the English translation for a general audience. Alongside the contributions the project gives to the scholarly community and to medieval studies as a whole, the project also has significant pedagogical value. It provides graduate students critical exposure to the mechanics of textual editing by giving them the opportunity to participate in the process of textual editing firsthand, and also to realize the benefits of learning to code using extensible markup language, or XML, according to a set of standards established by the Text Encoding Initiative, or TEI. TEI provides a set of regulations for XML, as well as a set of tools and open source software for the publication of digital editions by scholars who aren't data scientists or programmers like ourselves. A benefit of TEI is that it's also very flexible because it was designed for scholarly innovation. So we at Fordham have developed our own coding protocol that allows us to produce a digital text in which the standard apparatus of an academic edition is embedded in the body of the text. Another strength of the project is the chance for graduate students to take on leadership roles and present the project to the wider scholarly community, as we have the pleasure of doing today. And finally, the Siege of Antioch project also offers opportunity for students to build upon Old French language competency should it be important to their research.
So now that we've told you a little bit about what the project is, we want to give you a sense of how we do what we do. The basic workflow of the project goes like this. We receive edited and translated lessons from the UK editors on a semi-regular basis. On the left of the screen here is an example of an Old French edition of the text that we received from these editors. We also receive an important document shown on the right, which records the variant readings from each of the manuscripts. Using these two documents together, our next step is to code. So each of our editors signs up for individual lessons and codes them using XML according to the standards set by TEI. The video playing now is a demonstration of what this coding looks like in practice. The variant, which you can see highlighted on the left, is coded in a program called Visual Studio Code, which is shown here on the right. We open an application tab, and then we record the lemma or the accepted reading first. And in this case, the lemma comes from the manuscript Hatton 77. So I'm coding the manuscript as well as the lemma. I then record the rejected reading alongside this accepted reading. In this case, the rejected reading comes from the manuscript Spalding. And I copy the variant from the variants list into Visual Studio Code, close the reading apparatus, close the application, and then repeat this process. So this process continues for each line that there is a variant within the text, and each of our editors goes through this until the full less is completed. The process of learning to code the lessons is relatively easy to pick up, but questions do pop up, particularly around coding challenging or complicated variants and interpreting the variants list. So we meet weekly and code as a group, which makes the process more fun and more efficient. And if we can change the screen. Yes. Okay, so the result of the process is that the elements we have coded are available online as hover-overs, which are accessed by hovering over the text with your cursor. So what this looks like on our website as an interactive hover-over is shown in this image, in which case the accepted reading, which is Ken, is hovered over with the rejected reading from the manuscript Hatton 77, which has Ki on. This allows the readers to see the rejected reading alongside the accepted reading as they move through the text. This screenshot here is the organization of our workflow. After group members code each less, the project leaders, in this case Curtis and I, review each less, and then finally we get together as a group and go over them one last time before adding the completed lessons to our long draft, which is the file that contains all of our coded lessons and regularly gets uploaded to the website. The XML files are compiled and fed through additional HTML documents or programs that dictate the design and functionality of the hoverovers. The basic coded structure of the projects are these XML documents that our editors produce.
As we mentioned earlier, part of Fordham's work on the project is designing and coding hover-over apparatuses that are intended to contextualize the source for a non-specialist audience. These apparatuses are short character biographies, which we call personographies, places, and a glossary of terms. So just as we code variants in the manuscript witnesses, as Maria just demonstrated in the XML files, we also code for each of these additional elements. For example, you see in this image here, the line has been coded for Raymond, Count of St. Gilles, and our hover over gives some brief information about who he is, indicating his role as a leader of the Crusade army. Project editors are also involved in researching and writing longer biographies that are available on the website under the Resources tab that you see here. These are intended to be more in-depth explanations of people, places, and terms, and their importance within the text, as well as their historical significance. So you see here our personography index with Raymond's full-length biography that readers can navigate to the resources page and read through. The Siege of Antioch project is also a long-term work in progress, and it's been running for many years. Each academic year, the project coordinators articulate a new set of goals. So last year, our team spent a lot of time coding lessons and finished the initial rounds of a lot of lessons in coding. This year, we have made a concerted effort to make more progress through the workflow by doing more group edits and adding more lessons to the long draft, which makes up the text and translation page of the website. We've also been making an effort to write more of these character biographies, and we've compiled more of the longer biographies into the new Index of People page that I just showed you. And lastly, we'd also like to be building a table of contents to facilitate easier accessibility for the text.
So this has been the basic structure and workflow of the Siege of Antioch project. So if you have any questions, we'd be happy to take them, and we have our contact info listed here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Amazing. Lovely. Thank you so much. So we will now be diving into the Q&A. This is the Q&A for revisions as well. I wonder if I could kick things off too for Curtis and Maria. I don't know if you said this before, but could you tell me how many manuscript copies are there of the Siege of Antioch?
Yeah, so there's two primary manuscripts that the UK editors are working from, and then there's a couple of fragments. And so we kind of refer to them by shorthand, Hatton 77 and Spalding. But they're the two primary manuscripts that we have for the text.
Okay, so there are just a few, like I guess a handful of source copies then that you're working from. Great. Which I suppose in some ways makes it harder and easier. I see we do have a hand raised by resident fragment expert Lisa Fagan-Davis.
No, I didn't mean to cut her off though. I'm just whenever I'll go next. But or were you all finished? I'm sorry. Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
please,
I
go
didn't
ahead,
mean
yeah.
to jump in, but I'm just Anna, oh my God, I can't tell you what an absolute joy it is for me to see how this data has been enriched in such exciting and extraordinary ways. I first inventoried the Gottschalk and Tiefenol 30 years ago and sent that data to the original Countess database at least 20 years ago, if not 25 years ago. And it's such an amazing example of how data can be transmuted from one version to the next, to the next, to the next, as long as the data is extractable, right? That's what's so cool to me, is that this is the data that I typed into my little computer a million years ago and sent off to Countess. And now it continues to be used and reused and enriched. And it's just absolutely dazzling to me. And I have a question too about the Hart School of Music. I saw that sort of flash by in one of your slides. I have never heard of that collection. Can you just tell us, do they just have a few leaves on the wall, or do they actually have a collection of manuscript leaves?
My understanding is that one is just a leaf that's on the wall in the music department. Although it was a gift. See, all of these fragments from individual private collections often have a story behind them, and that one was a gift from a local rabbi who had collected, who was, I think, a rabbi and maybe also a cantor in his youth or something. I don't quite remember. But anyway, he had an interest in music and chant and so on, and went and bought this leaf on tour in Europe and gave it to the Hart School of Music. He was a big Hartford community pillar. And so he took his own collection of manuscripts and gave it to the Hart School of Music, and they framed this manuscript fragment, and it's now sitting in some office there.
That's wonderful. And also, this is a great example of how you don't have to have a collection of 500 fragments to be of use in scholarly work. You know, there's so many people out there who have a leaf that they bought at a garage sale or that they found somewhere that can make a real contribution by contributing to a project like Countess. It's really exciting that you're doing that kind of outreach.
Yeah, thank you.
That wasn't really a question. I know, it's just bubbling enthusiasm.
Oh, I'm glad you did that though, because if you hadn't raised your hand, I was planning on calling on you anyway, because I loved if anybody saw in the chat, she says, "My baby," as you start talking about.
It is my baby. It's the very first, it was my dissertation, was working on that manuscript. It's so wonderful to see it out there in the world.
Oh, I love it. It's so good. I did have I apologize. I know very little about music notation and manuscripts, but I was wondering if you could give us more of a sense, Anna, as well, of do we see similar types of notation in different types of music manuscripts as well? So as we try to get machines to be able to read this music notation, what is it we could be training them on? And then ultimately, what will we be able to read? Well, is there a vast diversity of music notation across different genres of text that we'll have to consider? Could you say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, music notation, I mean, much like people who work with text, you have your various kinds of text hands, and you have some that you see a lot, your Gothic textualis, Northern and Southern, and so on. You have some that you maybe see less often, depending on maybe it's more niche and it's only used in Spain in this century. And music notation is like that as well. So the most common one would be these sort of square notes that are sitting on a staff with lines, kind of like our modern staff, but the notes are square. That you see pretty widely from about the sort of high Middle Ages onward. And that is what we're currently training machine learning processes on, because that's sort of the most widespread and the most common. But you do have specific ones to, for example, in Germany, they kind of have these little weird square ones and so on, which would be a separate training. You'd have to have a new set of data to train it on, but the basic process of once you've trained it, then on the note shapes, the rest of it you can sort of plug in and use. As for the neumes, like Gottschalk has, again, there are a couple of different types, so that what he's using is fairly sort of German. But if something knew how to read Gottschalk, it would have a pretty good idea of how to read something else from sort of any kind of German-ish region.
Oh, I do want to remind our audience participants that please submit your questions to the chat as well. I see now there is a question from Yael for Curtis and Maria. Yael says, I wasn't fast enough to read the longer description about the character, but could you expand on what is planned to be there? I suppose she's talking about these personographies, the historical information, literary information, connections to other people and other characters. What is included, and I suppose what is left out of these personographies?
Yeah, I can pull it back up for just a quick second. So as I'm answering this, if you want to take a longer look at this screenshot from the resources page that we have here. What we envision for these personographies is more just some identifying information about who they are and their place in the Crusades, and some of their historical information. What we don't plan on moving into is connections to other people or characters or texts, just because there are so many people and there are so many narratives of the First Crusade that moving into sort of their connections to other people and places would bring us into a much larger project. And it's information that I think you can get from some of the other big works on the First Crusade. So the personographies just sort of allow for readers that are less familiar with the Crusades and all of these many people that are mentioned, some basic information and their place within this text. I mean, like you see, we have Muhammad here, for instance. So it's really geared towards a popular audience who may be familiar with a major historical figure like Muhammad, but also maybe a less major historical figure like Raymond, Count of St. Gilles, who maybe in this group of medievalists, we're all very familiar with people like this, but someone who's just looking for an English translation on the First Crusade may not be as familiar with some of the more detailed figures.
I actually had a question for you guys as well about, I was wondering if you could say more about the translation side of the project. What does that process look like so much? And how much do you share about the translation process, I suppose? Like what gets prioritized in the translation? Are we prioritizing the literary form of this text? Or are we trying to prioritize as literal or just discuss the translation, please, I suppose. What is being prioritized in the translation? Who is doing that and all of that?
Yeah, so I can talk about that as much as I can, but the edition and translation of the text is really undertaken by the UK team and not by the Fordham team. The Fordham team is the digital humanities side of things. So the management of the website, the designing of the code, and the hover over apparatuses, glossing the terms and things like that. But we don't actually do the addition or translation. There's, I mean, we showed it at the beginning of our slide. I could pull it back up again. But there's 4 of these scholars based in the UK, Linda Patterson, Carol Sweetenham, Parsons, and Lauren Mulholland. And they've been working on this text. Like I mentioned, it's very, very long. So much like us, they've been working through this text for many years as well. And they've presented it at conferences as well. So, I mean, I would say that the English translation is mostly just like a readable translation, not incredibly literal, but just intended for, a popular audience, again, who wants to look at an English translation of a First Crusade narrative to be able to easily read through and understand things.
Very cool. In terms of workflow as well, I was interested in how you're able to keep everything running and organized, considering that you're working so much with graduate students who are constantly cycling through programs. I mean, there's some stability there, but what does that look like in terms of essentially constantly training your team of people working on this project?
Yeah, so there's always new people joining. I think almost every semester, at least that we've been here, we've had new people come in. So the process of training is really meant to be very simple. We have a test list that we have new recruits do, so that way they're not working on, a new less that hasn't been coded before. They're kind of working on one that everyone is familiar with, and we can see how they do. It looks really complicated at first, but really it's very formulaic, and so training people to code is very easy. And then once people are all trained up on how to code, it really is organized in that Google Sheets. So they go ahead and they sign up for a less that they want, and then just redundancy. So having as many eyes check over the less as possible before we get it published. And that way we can organize, have one person do the initial code, have a more senior person check the code, and then have all of us group edit together. And that way we can catch any errors that might show up and make it a sort of collaborative process.
Lovely. And I'm sure they appreciate the opportunity as well, the graduate students, to expand into the digital humanities and language skills, as you mentioned before in your presentation. I suppose, do our presenters have any questions for each other? We still have about 3 minutes until we go to our break. And then at that point, we will have our keynote at the end of the event. But we do still have a couple minutes if anyone has any burning questions.
Oh, sure. I'll ask one. I guess, Anna, since we're so involved in like the coding process, how, involved are you in the sort of back end of the program that you use, or do you simply, input the data that you need and work it out that way? If that makes sense.
That does make some sense. So there's a couple of, because what Contes Ultimus is, what I was showing is there's the 2 facets of it. There's putting in the images and there's putting in the chant metadata. I do not myself work with any of the back end of how that works, but I am in close contact with the people that do. They are my colleagues at the DD Mall Lab at McGill. I think one of them is here in the chat. And on the other hand, there's the work at Contes Database. There I do a certain amount of transcribing the chants and filling in texts that are missing and so on, which is not code, it's data. So on the one hand, with the sort of textual aspect of it, I'd say I'm quite involved. With the code aspect of it, I'm not involved, but I'm fortunate to be able to discuss with the people who are, and sometimes request them to do things that I think would be interesting features to be able to enrich our data even more.
Like what sort of features? Oh, sorry.
What sort of features? Well, so for example, the ability to search these text letters that Gottschalk has in the margin was something that was in fact just implemented last week, when I thought it would be really interesting to see how this classification system works across the whole manuscript without having to look up each individual chant and what it's been called. And because that information had already been cataloged, it was simply a matter of porting it in and making it indexed and searchable. So yeah, that's something. I have other ideas about being able to bounce around different parts of the manuscript so that if there's a reference in one place, make it easier to go back to the chant that's being talked about there, since chants often appear several times in the same manuscript.
Curtis, did you have one last question before we go?
I just wanted to say really quickly, I think there was a question in the chat that we may have skipped over from Lisa Redlinsky, who asked if we're looking at the TEI or the XML. I imagine from some of the screenshots or the video from our presentation, Maria may be better able to answer this question, but you're looking at the XML, which is the code itself, whereas the TEI is the sort of like structure that governs the code, that allows us to sort of like write in a code that's specially made for digital editions of texts. But the code itself that we showed is XML.
Yes, the code is XML and the TEI sort of works through our website as well. So allows us to publish the code that we have written. So yeah, thanks for the question.
Great, thank you for catching that. I see. Last little follow-up, and then we will have to go to our break. But Lisa now asks, where is the TEI?
So the TI, it's sort of the display that's on our website. It helps us display it and it governs the rules. So it's kind of working in the background of everything that we do. Whereas the XML is the language that we code using. I hope that answers your question.
If there's any further questions, those can our audience members can contact our speakers directly if you guys don't mind. If you would, I know you shared your contacts at the end of the presentation, but if you could share your contacts in the chat as well, then people can contact you with their follow-up questions. But thank you so much for that. This is the end of session 4. We ran over just a little bit, but we will meet back here in a few minutes for our keynote. The keynote begins at 3 p.m. Eastern Time or 9 p.m. European Time. See you all then.
Okay, so if our next speakers want to test out any PowerPoints or anything of that nature, we can do that now
Great.
or in
Well,
the next couple minutes.
I think I'll probably be the one running the PowerPoint. So let me just give a shot and see if the screen share and all that's going to work.
Awesome.
So let's see what we can do. So I'll grab the.
And how do you each say your names?
My name is Anthony Massington.
Massington. Okay. And is Sarah Blick here? Is that how you say it correctly? Okay. Oh, your sound isn't working. Okay. Okay, sounds good.
And is the screen share coming through?
Yes, it is.
Great.
Do you need sound?
No, there's no audio.
Okay. Okay, and then we'll just give Sarah the opportunity to sign out and back in again, and hopefully that works. And just to be clear on what's happening, y'all are doing a presentation and there's going to be an opportunity to try it and then questions, or?
Can you
So
guys hear me?
Yes, now I can hear
Okay,
you.
good. Thank you.
Excellent.
So yes, we weren't 100% certain how we wanted to do that. So we've got a presentation to kind of just describe, what we've been doing and the how the game came together. And then yes, there was a link shared at the beginning of the day up in the chat to download the game. Participants.
Yeah, I think Will just shared it again, so everyone should definitely have it.
And then participants can fire it up if they want during the presentation, or afterwards during the Q&A. We thought we'd leave quite a bit of time for the Q&A session, but we also have a kind of screen captured demo as well during this, so that people who maybe don't want to download it or are having trouble getting it to run, they can still understand kind of the experience.
Awesome, sounds good. And then I think we're just about ready to get started. Okay, everyone, so welcome to our keynote. We're going to have a lot of fun with a game, the Mason's Loft. So if I can just introduce our two speakers. Sarah Blick is Professor of Art History at Kenyon College, teaching general art history and specialty classes on medieval and Asian art. In order to help students understand the spatial complexities and functions of medieval churches, she became interested in three-dimensional modeling and printing and has worked with Anthony Massinson on developing the cathedral game since 2014. Her early scholarly focus was on pilgrim souvenirs and the cult of St. Thomas Becket of Canterbury Cathedral, but she has since switched into to the even more obscure late Gothic parish church baptismal font covers and devotional practices. She enjoys editing and has published volumes of scholarly essays devoted to late medieval art, and is editor of Peregrinations, Journal of Medieval Art and Architecture for the International Society of the Study of Pilgrimage Art, and co-editor of Art and Material Culture in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, a book series published by Brill Press, Leiden. Anyone interested in publishing or in the latter two, please contact her. And our other speaker is Anthony Massinson, who holds a PhD in medieval studies from the University of York, UK. He was computing officer for the University of York Department of Archaeology, where he also lectured on historic building survey, computer applications in archaeology, 3D modeling, and supervised postgraduate research projects. He was also digital fellow at the Center for the Study of Christianity and Culture, also at York, where he was senior 3D modeler as well as mobile app developer for numerous digital projects at cathedrals and other historic sites across the UK. He founded Matchstick Cathedral, offering consultancy in digital projects for research and heritage management. Anthony met Dr. Blick in York, and they have been friends and colleagues for over a decade. So please welcome these two fine speakers and their excellent presentation.
Thank you. Well, just the fact that you lack of a camera image of me is pretty emblematic of some of the issues facing digital humanities projects and their potential users. A little while ago, my cat knocked the camera off and I tried to fix it without success. So, using that as a segue, how does someone like me, to whom tech has always been kind of a slapstick routine, use digital humanities? Okay, so what I'm going to do is give you the background of how I got interested in it, and then Anthony's involvement, and then I'm going to be very brief because Anthony's going to really tell you about it in detail. I had a pedagogical challenge when I taught medieval art, particularly medieval architecture, how to have students go from a two-dimensional plan or an elevation to really understanding the three-dimensional space. I mean, I'd show them things, I'd show the plans and the pictures and describe and blah, blah, blah. But while it was easy for me to envision, it really wasn't for many of my students. Some of them truly don't have the capability of doing this. My analogy is it's like pre-med students in organic chemistry. They need to be able to envision things like molecules in 3 dimensions and rotate those 3-dimensional molecules in their minds. And it's absolutely crucial. And organic chemistry and the inability to do this really ends many students' dreams of medical school. Now, the stakes of learning about medieval architecture are much lower, but nonetheless, I kept kind of going over this and over this in my mind. And quite a few years ago now, 3D printing was coming along and 3D modeling, and I thought this might be a way to do it. So I decided to try to learn the technology needed for this. And in brief, I tried and tried and failed and failed. And it didn't help that I kind of have the attention span of a toddler when things inevitably got complicated and failed when it comes to technology. So stuck, I kept thinking about this. But then, as Anthony mentioned, in 2014, I was co-directing an NEH summer seminar on devotional interaction in York. And there I met Anthony. And he has, what's the phrase, a very particular set of skills. He has a PhD in, of course, medieval buildings archaeology. He has tremendous interest and ability in technology. And perhaps most important, he has a friendly, accessible personality. And this means that he has the capability of understanding the kind of ideas that people are interested in when it comes to architecture, and has the skills to implement it and to explain it to people because he's also a teacher. So I have found that using this program has really transformed my teaching. My students are, I mean, I listen to them and the way they talk about it, they're actually able to discuss the spaces and how and why the spaces were planned the way they were, how they were used and how they changed throughout time as things went on. And my last thing I'm going to say here really is that in some ways, when we talk about the digital humanities projects, which all have been incredible learning about today, is you kind of have to factor in a type of person like me and like some of my students, where technology isn't always successful, where we might not have the attention span or maturity to deal with it. And in some ways, the need to make almost all of these digital humanities projects rather user-friendly. So now, with that segue, I'm going to turn you over to Anthony, who will truly explain this project in detail. And as you'll see, his work is amazing.
Thank you, Sarah. I hope I can live up to a little bit of that at least. So how do we go about building a game like this? And it's one arch at a time. So we have been working on a version of this game in one form or another for almost the last 10 years, which is a little bit mind-boggling how time slips away. But over that time period, our vision for what the game is and how the user experience should be and what the pedagogic goals, I think, have stayed pretty solid. But how we get those across have changed a lot. And we initially kind of came up with the idea of creating a game where a student would build an entire cathedral, literally one block of stone at a time. So they would have the centering for an arch. They would create the arch dimensions. Type of an arch, was it a Romanesque round-centered arch, or is it a two-centered or four-centered arch in the Gothic period and later? And then you would have block by block, you put the centering in on your piers, and then you build your arch, and then you pull the centering out, and it was physics simulated so the arch would stay up. And that sounds lovely. However, students don't have infinite time or infinite patience. Some students are gamers and love playing games, but the best thing to do to kill a hobby or an interest is to make it your work. And so assigning a game, even to the students who are the most enthusiastic, would probably be disrespectful of their time if the game wasn't kind of simplified and boiled down to its core. So also building an entire cathedral sort of one block at a time is quite a technical challenge as well. So we moved through iterations of this, and we came up with, we kind of quickly discarded the building it a block at a time, although Sarah and I have continued to like not quite let go of that idea, but maybe one day we'll get there. So how did we build a building game? In the end, instead of one block at a time, the current version of the game takes a bay by bay approach. So you go about building this cathedral one complete bay at a time. And here are all of the current building blocks all thrown together in a kind of glorious jumble of Romanesque and Gothic. None of it makes any structural sense, but it's still kind of pleasing to the eye. But these are all the current building blocks in the game. One bay at a time, every bay has a Romanesque and a Gothic counterpart. The Romanesque is based on Saint-Sonin in Toulouse, a beautiful, glorious beast of a Romanesque church. We used that as our basics for the Romanesque to begin with. At the time, this was tying in a little bit to some of Sarah's teaching on pilgrimage as well. And then for the Gothic version of this, we have Amiens, which is, you know, this obvious glorious type site of Gothic architecture in France as well. And it has the advantage of also being quite chunky as a cathedral. And so what we've done is created this hybrid where students build, it's kind of imagining what would happen to Saint-Sonin if it had grown up and gone from Romanesque to Gothic. And the idea is to get students a kind of more natural understanding of how buildings are a mishmash of architectural styles and periods, and how they organically grow over time. We came up with the idea of this being set in the Mason's Loft. The Mason's Loft is a place that exists at the Cathedral of York. It's also known as York Minster in the UK. I spent many, many, many happy hours up in this space, surveying it, crawling around on my hands and knees on top of the floor there, and talking with students and Masons and staff at the cathedral about this space. So it exists. There's the famous octagonal chapter house at York Minster, which sort of sits off on the northeast side of the building. It's attached to the building with this L-shaped vestibule. And what you're seeing in the image on the left, and sorry for the poor quality of images, it's actually quite difficult to find pictures of this. The building on the left is part of that vestibule, and it's going off from the north transept of the Minster. And above this vestibule corridor is a chamber. And you can see it in the windows up there, little tiny square-headed windows at the top. And in the middle, this is what that chamber looks like on the inside. This big open chamber, it has a fireplace in it, and it also has its own garderobe. It has its own toilet with a toilet that flushes with rainwater. It's pretty amazing. And the floor, the real showpiece here in this space, and it's very, very well lit. The real showpiece in this place is the floor that you can see the two figures standing on. And the gentleman who's standing on the left side in that is Mr. John David, who used to be the master mason of York Minster just a few years ago. So it's fitting that he's standing there. And he's actually standing literally almost in the footsteps of his predecessors, because there are the two medieval shoe prints in the floor when this floor is a gypsum plaster floor. It was put down wet, and then somebody up there stood in it like feet in wet concrete, and their footprints are preserved. And he's standing almost literally in the footsteps of his predecessors. But the real star, of course, is not even that floor. It's that the floor is covered with tracings, with one-to-one scale drawings of architectural pieces of the Minster and of St. Michael of Belfry Church, which is like 17 feet away from the Minster on its south side. And the Minster was responsible for the upkeep of its fabric. And so we see John Harvey's survey of the principal lines and features on that floor. And you can see very clearly there's the tracery plan for the tracery of a window. These are the windows in the choir at the Minster. And then there's also a double set of arches. And these are the 16th century arches for Michael of Belfry next door. So we have a 14th century window tracery and 16th century arches. Does that hint at a long continuity of use by many masons? Maybe. Like everything, this is up for grabs. But the idea of the place where the masons worked to design and build cathedrals is kind of fundamental to our concepts, which is thus the name of the game, the Mason's Loft. So this is the scene you saw again. So I made a model of the Mason's Loft and I put it into a game engine. And here is an early 2018 prototype of how this was supposed to work. You may not be able to see it through compression issues, but there's a grid on the floor. You can move through the space. You lay down individual bays. You say what kind of bay you want. And then you lay down that bay there. You can move around the space, and in real time, you can plunk down another one. You can rotate it. Then you can build it. So you just build a crossing here, kind of on the floor in this cozy space. And this was lovely. This was really fun to work on. It had a number of problems. One of the problems is simple usability. This uses video game controls, the WASD controls for any of the gamers in here. WASD on the keyboard, control your forward, back, side to side motion. And then you have independent control with the mouse. Oh, and then now you can go down into first person perspective, so you can walk through the thing you just built. And that was kind of the core concept. And you can still do that in the current version of the game, but you'll notice we've left a few things out of the game for, I think, very good reasons. So one of the things we left out of the game was the actual Mason's Loft itself. It became very, very clear that the setting of the Mason's Loft, despite that beautiful photorealistic real-time rendering, was distracting to students and didn't actually add anything to the pedagogic goals of the game. So we went for a pure abstract plane. And then, so here's a version about a year later. And this is how you just build the apps of your building. So you just lay down the fan of the apps, and then you kind of choose if you want a chapel or do you just want a plain wall, and you go around the building. So you can see that this still looks a lot like the original one that's set in the actual Mason's Loft, but this is in a more abstract space. So throughout this game, we were prioritizing clarity of usability, clarity of visuals, and we're trying to do clarity of interface and interaction. And those are skills that it's no wonder that game companies have whole armies of people to work on user experience, because it's key, it's important, and it's a whole study in itself. And here we are, just two medievalists trying to make something for our students. So this was another version of that, but it's still not as clear as we would like for students to have. So the current version has been updated. We have a different perspective now. We have what's called an isometric perspective, which gives you the 3D and the 2D together. It still allows you to move around, but instead of having to use video game WASD and mouse steering controls, we now have just a more kind of like arrow keys based. I mean, WASD are still our arrow keys, but kind of an arrow keys based way of navigating around your space. And things are a little bit more abstract, but I think clearer. So when you lay down a bay now, the bay isn't ghosted. It is just that bay itself. And then it gives a little bounce when you've actually set it in space. There's no more drop-down menus, so you don't have to have a vocabulary for what each piece mean, where how do I know what a northeast corner of a crossing is if I'm an undergraduate fresh to this vocabulary and jargon. So we're trying to make it as visual and clear as possible. And we still have a long way to go. So I'm going to try to see if this is going to work. I'm going to try to jump into a live demo of the game on my computer. It may not work, and we can just move on from there. Let's see what happens. Oh, it's not going to open the specified file. Of course it's not going to. Nope, it's not going to do that for me. Okay, that's fine. We can either jump out and see the game live. I'll get the game working live on the screen at the end of the presentation, so we can just walk around, and we can move forward here, and then we'll just get the game going. And you all have links to the game anyway. This is just the starting menu screen of the game. One thing I would like to emphasize is that this game was always developed with teaching and learning in mind first and foremost, and usability and clarity first and foremost. So it may not be sort of beautiful photorealistic rendering of these architectural pieces. They're not at the highest fidelity you could have, and we did that for a number of reasons. First of all, we really are trying to make sure that this game is as playable as possible to as many people using as many different types of hardware as possible. And by many types of hardware, I'm still talking about desktop or laptop devices. This is not suitable on a touch device yet. That'd be a whole other user interface experience. So we want to make sure that it works on really old machines. I developed it on a really old Mac computer. And so if it can play on that, then you can play it on more modern machines. A lot of the students at Kenyon, at least, will have Mac laptops from within the last 2 years, because a lot of them got them as gifts before they went off on their freshman year. And so I had to make sure that it plays on the newer Macs, which have a new chip set and architecture in them. I have to make sure it runs on Windows machines as well. And I have to make sure it runs on machines that both have dedicated graphics cards and no graphics cards at all. Thus, the more simplified rendering. If some of you have already played the game, you'll notice that it might look a little blurry on your screens, and that's because I've purposefully downsampled the resolution on the screen so that your computer is pushing fewer pixels, because it runs hot. Somebody else who's already demoed it said it really ran hot on their machine, caused their GPU to work really hard. That's an optimization problem. It runs pretty nicely on a laptop these days and doesn't burn too much battery too quickly. But there's a lot of these sort of technical aspects. We wanted to be kind to the students so that it would work and would not discourage them from the beginning, although we still run into lots of technical issues. The other thing is that we want to cater to a kind of low level of familiarity with today's conventional video game, 3D video game user interface conceits or paradigms. So initially I had done this whole thing, which was a WASD experience, first person, where you were like running through a real space and you could pick up things and move them and plunk them down and build them and change them. And you'd have to be using, your mouse, your left hand and your right hand on the keyboard at the same time, which was kind of natural for a more experienced gamer, but deeply unnatural for people who are not experienced gamers in a first person 3D perspective, at least. So we keep trying to whittle that down as well to make ease of use and navigation of space. And therefore, we also have to kind of clamp down the scope of our features in the game. We also want to respect the user's time. The idea is that a person should be able to build some form of complete church within about 15 minutes on this game. And then finally, this game does not succeed on its own. Where this game succeeds, it succeeds because it is paired with an assignment. So it's a two-part tool. One part is the game itself. The second part is the assignment. And the way this assignment has classically gone is students are asked to do this twice, to make two churches. And they make one church at the beginning of the semester, and when they're kind of still fresh to medieval architecture and church architecture. And they make a church. And one thing the game does is it allows you to save screenshots of the sort of 3D view of your church, but at the same time, it will also print a 2D plan of the building you have built. And you'll see those in a minute. So you're supposed to produce a screenshot of a building that you have built, just spend 15 minutes on it. And then a few weeks later, towards the last third of the term, you're asked to build a second church using the experience and what you've learned throughout that term. And then the assignment is to write up the differences between the two churches, why you created two different buildings, and then to try to imaginatively engage in why did it suddenly change periods? Why did I decide in my new church to add a massive transept or to add a huge chevet of chapels? And what would those possibly be used for? So that the students, the assignment is key in that the students are imagining while they're building the sorts of people and economic circumstances, religious circumstances, and goals of the owners of the building, as well as the visitors to and the users of that space. So you're getting a narrative involved as well. And all of this is to try to help students see how style and form and function and history and multiple competing users in the same space all fit together to make these buildings, which are such a kind of glorious mishmash of different periods and cultures and ideas. So looking at some student examples, this is student work. We had an option for our students if they did not want to use the technology or the technology fell down, because I'm the lone coder and programmer on this, and there's bugs all over still. You may have encountered some already. So they could do a purely paper option, a purely paper exercise. So that's what you see on the left. Some students really just took it away and made massive single period buildings that were, as we like to say in the business, absolute units. So in the middle, you see some absolute monster Romanesque only buildings. And then we had some students on the right who engaged with the buildings in an imaginative way, in a multi-period way, where you have Gothic west ends kind of stuck onto Romanesque earlier parts of the church, or you have complete fantasy buildings like you have in the lower right corner of the screen, which would never hold up, but the students still thought through a narrative of, let's imagine that the walls are all sealed off, or maybe they left it half built because they ran out of money or something like that. But they're imagining why this space would look this way. And we're looking at it. Here's a specific case study of a student who has the first build from the first part of the term on the left. And it's churchy shaped and spaced, but it's more of a castle, especially more of kind of a Norman Romanesque castle. And then after 4 or 5 weeks in class, built the second church. And you can see from the plan there, as well as the appearance in 3D, you can see that there's more of an understanding for the conventions of the building, but also for maybe why it would be built this way. I mean, it's a really interesting construction in that it has a Gothic west end, and it's got a Romanesque double-towered east end, and a very kind of German, almost double apse, even though there's no apse here, but a double-ended kind of German cathedral. But they talked through why they made these decisions and what the people of the time in their imaginary church were thinking when they created this building over a period of centuries. By the way, as a little note, students, the only gamey part of this is the students have a counter on a number of moves they have per 2 architectural periods. You start out in the Romanesque, and you can only build so many bays before you run out of moves, and then it changes to Gothic. And then you can either finish your plans, but it's in Gothic, or you can tear down and build over bits with Gothic to try to simulate. It takes a long time to build these, and styles change. There's also a cheat key, which lots of students found. I told them there was a key, but I didn't tell them which one it was. There's a cheat in there that you can just stick, you can just give yourself infinite turns in one period or the other, which is why you get some of those absolute unit Romanesque buildings. Where do we want to go in the future with this? Well, so since we started on this project, there are a whole lot of games that have come out which are just called town builders. They're not city builders. They're not simulating anything. There's no goals. You just build. And the ease of use of these games is amazing. It's using several algorithms. This was started out by, I guess it does have sound. This is by Oscar Stahlberg. It's called Townscaper. You can buy it on Steam. All you do is point and click, and the game figures out all the rest. And you feel like a creative genius, but you're not doing anything except pointing and clicking. And Oscar Stahlberg is a creative genius who has made these amazing organic cities possible just by clicking on a grid. But the ease of use is tremendous. Then that was back in 2020, and now a whole bunch of these Townscaper-like games are starting to come out. And I'm going to show you 3 that are going to come out in 2024. My favorite one is Tiny Glade by Pouncelight. It's coming out really soon, and the level of detail and interactivity here is astonishing, but also it's just really easy to use. There's not a lot of 3D scene navigation, but the creators have made it so, again, you have this amazing sense of power, but you can choose whether to put in arches or windows, and watch what happens when you put windows together. They automatically combine. You can pet the sheep. You can simulate sort of age, wear and tear. You can build things up and then ruin them, and it's all super cute and cozy. I would love to make our cathedral builder work and look a little bit more like this, but that's a lot of work. Another one coming out is called Summer House by a man named Friedman.
Hi, I'm Friedman.
Yeah, there we go.
I've been making indie games. Games like Highlanders and Super.
Sorry. This game is in 3D, but the interface is mostly 2D, which again eliminates the complexity of a 3D interface. And when you're done building your building, you can see it in a little bit of 3D. I think it's another interesting approach. Okay, and then this last one is called Monterona by Slava Korolev. And this one is interesting in that you're creating a whole Italian village while listening to narration from your grandma, basically. So there's literal narration and building put together, and it kind of helps you come up with different stories. So I like the literal narrative going on in a game like this. So we're headed this direction. I want to make that popping ease of use. I want to make it better and better. And I also want to work with more details, literally popping into these cathedrals so that students have this sense of creativity and moving quickly and on the fly, but also being really invested in the detail of their spaces. And someday we will get there. So that's all we've got for slides today. I think we can move into the questions period, and I can try to get the actual game running live on my machine while we take some questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions, either in the chat or if you're on video? Yes, with your hand raised.
Yes, hi. I was wondering, can you export these models that the students make and what format can you export them in?
That's a really good question. So the answer is yes and no. So the answer is that you can export your save file to the game, and then a student can, and it's very small in terms of byte size, and students can share that save file and re-import it. So they can, if they made a cathedral, they could give it to their friend who also had the game, and they could import it, and they'd have their friend's cathedral there. Can you export the geometry itself so you could use it in other 3D software? Not yet. That's something that, again, it would be possible to do. We haven't focused on that because our goals were not necessarily for the students. We figure most of our students are not conversant with 3D software. And so they wouldn't have a lot of use to be able to export it. If we did export it, we would export it in OBJ format, which is a pretty stable, archivally, pretty easy to read and interchangeable 3D format. There's no interactions with it. So just the static model of what they've built, we absolutely certainly could do as an export. We just haven't done that at this time. And I'm going to jump in and just see if I can get the game to go.
Do we have any other questions? Because if not, I have a question.
Oh, yes, please.
Really, I related to what you said about kind of being like finding technology to be difficult, and you really want things to be as easy as possible. And I really I wonder how that simplicity that you're doing with the technology and trying to make it as straightforward as possible interacts with the pedagogy of the actual assignments and how you're teaching this material.
I can speak to that a little bit. There are always going to be, again, because as Anthony said, they're working on all different kinds of computers and all different kinds of skill levels. And there are some students who just throw up their hands. They can't handle it. And I totally understand. And that's fine. They can sketch it. It doesn't matter. But I would say that happens maybe 5% of the students. Most of them are, really raring to go with this. And what I do find is initially, especially with the first church build, they're really focused on, am I doing this right? Am I doing this game right? And I keep having to kind of go back to them and like, try it, do whatever you want. If you don't like it, start it up again. You should not have to take more than 15 minutes, working through this. So once they kind of get over the hurdle of, oh my God, I'm working on this. I'm hearing myself back. That was weird. Anyhow, the point is that then to really dovetail it to the point of the class, which is, learning about obviously the Middle Ages, medieval art and architecture, is to say, okay, you've sort of built this thing. What can you tell me about it? And, during the class, we've been learning about terms and functions of different spaces and why people built what they did and how they had to really adjust for real life things. There's a cathedral in Switzerland, for instance, that they had a road running through the crypt. It was a major busy road. So how are you going to handle that? And so I would kind of challenge them, like, why are you putting this here? What's going on with your church? And some of the sort of details of the assignment, particularly the second rebuild, is I tell them that there's 3 elements they have to deal with. One is where the church is being built, because there's regional styles. And then what kind of church is it? Is it a pilgrimage church? Is it a parish church? You know, that sort of thing. And then there is some crisis. And I have very broad crises like patronage problems or, that sort of thing. And I said, you can choose two of the three and I'll choose the third. And so it gives a tiny little element of they have a chance. And so far, they've really responded, especially when they go, I can't find anything written on this. I'm like, yeah, because it doesn't exist. Use, what we've talked about, what we've read in class to imagine yourself dealing with these issues. And so, again, sorry to go on. So far, it's really worked out well.
Yeah, and that's
all.
so good to hear. That what I really like is the imaginative engagement that the students begin to have. The first in the beginning they're just finding their feet, but by the end they really are engaging imaginatively with not necessarily with the software, although some of them will use the pieces that are intended for very specific purposes in very creative ways. But they're engaging imaginatively with the process of building one of these spaces. They're asking not just abstract questions of form. They're asking, why would I want to do this to begin with? Why do I want a transept with multiple chapels? Why do I want to have a super long nave? If it was a British cathedral, a super long and low nave, like they're starting to ask why they're doing that. And they're starting to draw together the different elements that they've been learning throughout the semester and kind of expressing that with this game as a framework for doing that. And I think that's been the most satisfying part of this for me, is to just see their creativity.
Yeah, that's all super fascinating. I have to admit, if it were me, I would probably accidentally be one of those people who does it on paper and then realizes that they should have done it in the game.
Oh, it's okay.
Maybe that's just a confession. Just
too.
because I struggle with technology, but it's great that you make something like this where they have this opportunity to really explore. Do we have any other questions? We have a few minutes left. Yes, Will.
I'm sorry, I'm also just watching Anthony build, and it's really cool to see. I was curious about what guided your decisions on which pieces to include as building blocks, if you like, because I know that this isn't Minecraft, right? You're trying to give students a very structured way of interacting with the architecture, and I imagine there are only so many options or choices for bits that you can give them before things get a bit overwhelming. So yeah, what was your selection process like?
Anthony, do you want to take this?
Sure. I think, that's been the big struggle the whole time, is to try to not make it overwhelming, but to still try to make it be a little bit expressive. There's quite a needle that we're trying to thread here. And so that's how Sarah and I kind of landed on, let's do this bay by bay. There's only so many big bay units in a kind of conventional Western cathedral of any period that you can create. And we went by big units, so we're not doing furniture. I think Sarah would especially really like to get to furniture, and I agree.
Yes,
it's just that it's a whole other challenge about getting the experience right, getting the ease of use, and you just increase complexity a lot. So we're kind of going with very basic units just to get the idea across for our students, and just trying to work with basics. Like I said, I'd love to make a more creative thing. Sarah and I are working on a future version of this where it's a little bit more like Townscape, or a little bit more like Tiny Glade, where you can just lay out, a pier foundation, a pier base, pull it up, put in one next to it, an arch appears. You can change the arch shape. You make your triforium, you make your clear story. Once you've created a whole bay, you've learned about individual elements of architecture and style, and then that bay becomes your base unit for your cathedral, and you can kind of duplicate those bays, and then you realize, oh my goodness, how do I turn a corner in a transept? Like, how do I actually build a transept? Those are some of the hardest things to do, but you wouldn't notice until you try to build one. That's a longer experience and a more technically difficult and more technically challenging experience to build, but we're hopeful that we can get there eventually.
That sounds amazing, and it's a good job. It'll come out after I finish my PhD, otherwise it would be in jeopardy because I would be spending days on that.
With creativity. I just really quickly, I'd like to say that now that we're like walking around inside this thing I just built, we can see that the graphics are not fantastic. They're not great. Initially, we went for this low poly look. It was a little bit quicker for me to model. I do have a day job, and this was a nights and weekends sort of process. So anything to speed that up. But also, again, we're trying to respect the horsepower of a lot of the machines that this will run on, and making this a better lit and a more photorealistic space is it limits our users, again, because we're working with people with, like I said, I started building this on a 10-year-old Mac, and it could still just about run on that. So I didn't want to overload them, but there's a huge part of me that would love to go back to that original Mason's Loft prototype that we have with all the beautiful photorealistic rendering and lighting, and create a more immersive space like that. But I don't think it would serve the pedagogical goals of the project.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. Lynn.
Thanks. I've really enjoyed hearing about this, and both about the solutions you've chosen and the pedagogical success that you're experiencing. And just in here in this interior space, it occurred to me to ask, these people are creating their cathedral, although they could be doing it in relation to a plan that exists. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And is there any part of this game that sort of tells them that what they've built is possible? I mean, that kind of assesses, the feasibility of the structure, not to say it's historical accuracy or anything like that. I'm just kind of curious.
Not really. I mean, I go over and talk with each of the students, because now I'm teaching a small liberal arts college, so my classes aren't, there may be 30. So I talk to them and I'm like, do you really think that would stand up? And they were like, oh yeah. And I'm like, how do you know? I mean, I kind of push them that way, but we don't really have, do we, Anthony? I don't think we do.
There's no
alarm bells.
Physics simulation going on in here. That's another order of technical magnitude. We're starting to think of this game almost as having separate modules. There may be a link that the organizers here may share. I sent it to them, to another game that we made that we worked with last year, which is just build one single bay. And you start off with pre-Romanesque, and then you work your way into Romanesque in an English parish church context. And that's like a separate game. Almost, we'd love to have like 3 modules. One's like the very granular one where you build a single bay, and maybe that's got a physics simulation. And then you take that physics simulated bay, once that one is stable, you take that, you use it as a bay in something like the main game here, where you drop bay by bay on there, and then the whole physics simulation takes over again. The horsepower, the computing horsepower for that is complicated. But I would love to be able to talk about building statics and why, everybody says that buildings were built with so high quality. We have these buildings that are 1,000 years old and they're still standing, and why can't we build like that today? And of course, it's survivor bias, because a lot of them did fall down because they weren't built well. It's just they didn't last that long. So I would love to kind of illustrate, again, some of the reasons why these look the way they do is because that's the way masonry structures stand up if you want to make them of a certain size. Yeah, so definite goals for the future.
Thank you. It's been really interesting to see what this is able to do in the classroom and for assignments.
Thank you.
Well, I think we're just about out of time. If y'all can put your contact information in the chat, I'm sure people would love to follow up with you and get in touch. But thank you again for a wonderful presentation and such an interesting game and teaching tool. Thank you for all of the people who aren't clapping because they're not on screen. But I'm going to throw it over to Will now for some closing remarks.
And I'm actually just going to one more time put that link to the game in the chat, just for anyone that still would like to get it and check it out. Thank you. Yep, absolutely. Just seconding Andrea, thank you again. It's a really, really interesting project. As a big fan of Cozy Builders, I know that's not the purpose of it. It's a pedagogical tool, I know that, but I can't deny, as a big fan of Cozy Builders, that that is very appealing to me. But this concludes the end of our keynote and therefore the end of the second Digital Humanities Showcase. We've had a lot of great conversations today, and we've been able to see some really amazing projects on display. So I'd just like to take these last few minutes to thank everybody who was involved in making this second showcase a reality. Of course, thank you to Lisa Fagan-Davis for supporting the graduate committee and allowing us to do things like this. Thank you massively to Chris Cole, who is the only way that any of this is possible, running all the technology, being with us all the way through this to help field any questions and sort any issues. Thank you so much. Thank you also to Maria Thomas, Maggie Heeshen, and Lauren Lee for organizing and hosting many of these sessions. And also thank you to Andrea for moderating that final session. And of course, thank you to all of our panelists. This wouldn't be possible without you, and we're so grateful that we're able to facilitate these conversations and to share your work with other members of the Medieval Academy. If you've been attending many of the sessions, you'll know that we've had contact details shared in the chat throughout. If you've missed anything, you can always refer to the schedule for the showcase, and you can get the names and I'm sure follow up with people that way. Please do be on the lookout going forward for more information about our next upcoming workshop, which is accessing libraries and archives around the world. It's going to be from 11 to 12:40 Eastern Time on the 27th of February. That will also be, of course, a Zoom workshop. Please do listen to the latest episode of the Multicultural Middle Ages podcast. If you have an idea for an episode, we'd love to hear it. The call for proposals for the next season is done, but be on the lookout for another call in the future, and we'd always love to hear if you've got an idea ahead of time. If you're at any of the major conferences, so that would be the MAA annual meeting, Kalamazoo or Leeds, please do come along to our GSC sponsored sessions and any social events and extra things that we're organizing there. As we get closer to each conference, you'll be able to hear more about those. We'll be running mentorship programs at each of those. So that's another way to get involved and to meet other students and scholars. At the annual meeting itself, of course, come along to our graduate student social, which is going to be on Thursday the 14th at O'Rourke's Pub in South Bend, which will just be a few minutes south of Notre Dame's campus. That starts at 8:30 p.m. On Saturday the 16th of March, we're going to be having an informal mentoring breakfast from 9:15 to 10:15, which is in collaboration with the MAA's Inclusion and Diversity Committee. So that's a place for students and scholars to come along, have coffee, pastries, and chat. All of this, of course, will be in the conference program. In fact, already is. So if you have access to that conference draft, you can see this all right there. And as I said, for the other conferences, more information will come out as we get closer to them. So I think all that remains for me to say is thank you all for joining us today. We hope that these sessions spark new conversations, new ideas about how to use digital humanities to bring the medieval world to students, scholars, and the general public all over the world. Thank you.